In the spring of 1869, when demolition workers began tearing down the abandoned Blessed Widow's Christian home on East 42nd Street in Manhattan, they made a discovery that would haunt New York City for decades. Behind a false wall in the basement, they found 52 wooden coffins arranged in perfect rows, each containing the remains of an elderly woman. But these weren't ordinary burials. Each skeleton wore expensive jewelry, and beside every coffin lay a handwritten ledger entry detailing the woman's net worth down to the penny. The most chilling discovery came when investigators realized that according to official records, not a single one of these 52 women had ever died at the institution. They had simply vanished. For 22 years, the Blessed Widow's Christian Home had operated as Manhattan's most trusted charity for destitute widows, praised by newspapers and endorsed by prominent churches across the city. Yet somehow every wealthy widow who entered its doors had signed over her entire fortune to the institution before mysteriously disappearing without a trace. Before we uncover the horrifying truth behind these 52 missing souls, if you're brave enough to hear stories that most people would rather forget, hit that subscribe button now. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those who dare to explore the darkest chapters of American history. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? We want to know where our fearless community of mystery seekers is located. What made this discovery even more disturbing was that the investigation would reveal a carefully orchestrated system of murder that had operated in plain sight, blessed by the church and celebrated by society for over 2 decades. The killer's methods were so refined, so perfectly disguised as Christian charity, that even the most suspicious minds never questioned what was happening behind those welcoming doors. In the 1840s, Manhattan was a city of dramatic contrasts that would shape one of America's most sinister crimes. While the wealthy built grand mansions along Fifth Avenue, their marble facades gleaming in the afternoon sun, thousands of immigrants crowded into tenements that stretched from the Bowery to the Hudson River like a sea of human desperation. The air itself told the story of inequality, perfumed and pristine in the uptown neighborhoods, thick with coal smoke and unwashed humanity in the downtown warrens where hope went to die. Among the most vulnerable were elderly widows, women who had lost their husbands and found themselves alone in an unforgiving city with little family support and even less legal protection. The law offered them no safeguards. A woman's property automatically transferred to her husband upon marriage, and widowhood often meant poverty, regardless of how comfortable their married life had been. Many discovered that their late husband's business partners or relatives had already claimed what they assumed would be their inheritance, leaving them with nothing but memories and the clothes on their backs. It was into this world of feminine vulnerability that Margaret O'Brien arrived in 1845, claiming to offer salvation. The Blessed Widow's Christian Home stood at 127 East 42nd Street, a 3-story brownstone building that had been converted from a private mansion with meticulous attention to creating an atmosphere of safety and respectability. The building's facade was painted a warm cream color that caught the morning light beautifully, with black shutters that were always perfectly maintained and window boxes filled with seasonal flowers that changed with mathematical precision. A brass plaque beside the heavy oak door read simply, "Blessed Widow's Christian Home, founded 1845, a haven for God's forgotten daughters." Margaret O'Brien was a woman of striking presence who understood instinctively how to project exactly the image that inspired trust. At 40 years old when she founded the home, she was tall and imposing without being intimidating, with steel-gray hair that she wore pulled back in a style that suggested both piety and competence. Her clothes were always of good quality, but never ostentatious, dark colors that spoke of respectability, fabrics that whispered of prosperity without shouting of excess. Her eyes were perhaps her most remarkable feature. Pale blue and penetrating, they could convey maternal warmth during public events and absolute authority in private conversations. O'Brien claimed to be an Irish immigrant who had arrived in New York in 1839 with impeccable references from Catholic charities in Boston. She spoke with just enough of an accent to seem authentic, but not so much as to appear foreign or unrefined. Her backstory, which she shared selectively and always with appropriate emotion, told of a comfortable childhood in County Cork, marriage to a successful merchant who died young of consumption, and a calling to serve God by caring for other women who had suffered similar losses. She had partnered with two individuals who complemented her skills perfectly. Catherine Kelly served as the institution's head caretaker and medical attendant. Kelly was a small, energetic woman in her mid-30s with graying brown hair and hands that were always busy, mending, cleaning, measuring medications, or writing detailed notes about each resident's condition. She moved through the building like a woman who knew every creak in the floorboards, every draft from the windows, every sound that meant something was amiss. Her background, according to the references she provided, included training as a nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital and experience caring for elderly patients in private homes throughout New England. Father Patrick Walsh completed their trio as the institution's chaplain and spiritual counselor. Walsh was young for a priest, barely 30 years old, with dark hair that curled slightly despite his attempts to keep it severely styled, and brown eyes that seemed to hold genuine compassion for human suffering. He was handsome in a way that made elderly women want to mother him and younger women forget their place, but he carried himself with the appropriate dignity of his calling. His voice was his greatest asset, rich, warm, and perfectly modulated for both intimate counseling sessions and formal sermons. Together, they had created what appeared to be a model Christian charity. The home's mission statement, engraved on a bronze plaque in the entrance hall, read, "To provide loving Christian care for widowed women of good character who find themselves without family support in their twilight years, that they might live their remaining days in dignity, surrounded by sisters in faith, and pass into eternal rest with the comfort of knowing they have been loved." The institution operated on a sliding scale that seemed both practical and compassionate. Wealthy widows could contribute their savings as an entrance fee, securing private rooms on the building's second floor and receiving what O'Brien termed premium care, private nursing when needed, special meals to accommodate dietary requirements, and assistance with personal correspondence and financial affairs. Women of modest means could earn their keep by working in the home's kitchen, laundry, or garden, sharing rooms on the third floor, but participating equally in all social and religious activities. The building itself had been renovated with careful attention to creating an atmosphere of home rather than institution. The entrance hall featured polished mahogany wainscoting and wallpaper in soft florals that suggested a well-maintained private residence. A large oil painting of Christ blessing the children dominated one wall, while the opposite wall displayed framed photographs of previous residents who had graduated to their eternal reward, as O'Brien delicately phrased it. The ground floor housed the common areas where residents spent most of their day. The sitting room was furnished with comfortable chairs arranged in small conversation groups, tables for card games or needlework, and shelves lined with books, newspapers, and religious texts. Large windows faced the garden, providing natural light and views of the carefully maintained flower beds that several residents tended as their contribution to the home's operation. The dining room could accommodate all 30 residents comfortably at 3 long tables covered with crisp white linen. Each place setting included proper china and silver, small touches that reinforced the home's commitment to maintaining dignity and respectability. Meals were served at precise times, breakfast at 7, dinner at noon, and supper at 6, with residents expected to dress appropriately and observe proper etiquette. The kitchen was Catherine Kelly's domain, where she supervised the preparation of meals with the assistance of several residents who worked to earn their keep. The kitchen was modern for its time, with a large coal stove, multiple work surfaces, and a pantry stocked with quality ingredients. Kelly insisted on fresh vegetables from the garden when possible, and made arrangements with local merchants for meat, dairy, and other staples. The second floor contained the private rooms for premium residents, each furnished with a bed, wardrobe, writing desk, and comfortable chair. These rooms were decorated individually to reflect their occupants' tastes, with residents encouraged to bring personal belongings and family photographs to make the space feel like home. A small library at the end of the hall provided additional reading material and a quiet space for private reflection. The third floor housed shared rooms for residents who contributed labor rather than money, as well as the staff quarters. While less luxurious than the private accommodations below, these rooms were clean, comfortable, and decorated with the same attention to detail that characterized the rest of the building. But perhaps the most important space in the entire building was the chapel that O'Brien had installed in what had once been the mansion's ballroom. The chapel was a beautiful space with vaulted ceilings, stained glass windows depicting scenes from the life of Christ, and wooden pews that could accommodate all residents comfortably. The altar was simple but elegant, topped with a marble cross and flanked by arrangements of fresh flowers that residents took turns providing from the garden. Each morning began with communal prayers in this chapel at precisely 6:30. Father Walsh conducted daily Mass for the Catholic residents while offering non-denominational services for the Protestant women. His sermons emphasized themes that resonated deeply with women who had experienced great loss: the Christian virtues of charity and forgiveness, the importance of accepting God's will even in times of suffering, and the spiritual benefits of releasing attachment to worldly possessions in preparation for eternal life. The daily routine was structured but not oppressive, designed to provide the comfort of predictability while allowing for individual preferences and needs. After morning prayers and breakfast, residents could choose how to spend their time. Many gathered in the sitting room for conversation or needlework, working on quilts, clothing repairs, or decorative items that were sold at local markets to raise funds for the home's operation. The garden behind the building provided another popular activity, especially during the warmer months. Residents could tend flower beds, grow vegetables for the kitchen, or simply sit in the shade and enjoy the relative quiet compared to the busy streets beyond the walls. The garden was enclosed by a high brick wall that provided privacy and security, with gates that were kept locked except during designated outdoor periods. Reading was encouraged, with residents having access to both religious texts and secular literature. O'Brien maintained subscriptions to several newspapers and magazines, ensuring that the women could stay informed about current events. She often led discussions about news articles during evening gatherings, encouraging residents to share their opinions and experiences related to the topics of the day. Evening meals were particularly important social occasions where residents shared stories of their past lives, discussed their hopes and concerns, and formed the friendships that made the home feel like a true community. O'Brien often joined these meals, asking about each woman's day and noting any concerns or needs that required attention. What made the Blessed Widow's Christian home particularly attractive to potential residents was its reputation for individualized care and genuine respect for each woman's dignity. Unlike the city's overcrowded poorhouses, where elderly women were warehoused in grim conditions with minimal care, or the expensive private arrangements that many widows could not afford, the home offered a middle path that seemed both practical and compassionate. The staff-to-resident ratio was unusually generous. 1 staff member for every 6 residents, allowing for personal attention to each woman's needs, whether medical, spiritual, or simply emotional. Catherine Kelly maintained detailed records of each resident's health status, medications, dietary requirements, and personal preferences. Father Walsh made himself available for private counseling sessions, offering spiritual guidance and emotional support to women struggling with grief, loneliness, or anxiety about their futures. Most importantly, the home had established a reputation for helping residents navigate the complex legal and financial challenges that many elderly widows faced. O'Brien herself was well versed in matters of inheritance law, property rights, and estate planning. She frequently assisted residents in organizing their affairs, contacting lawyers to draft or update wills, and ensuring that their final wishes would be properly executed. This assistance with legal matters had become one of the home's most valued services. Many women arrived with their financial affairs in disarray, unsure of their rights, or uncertain about how to protect their interests. O'Brien's guidance helped them understand their options and make informed decisions about how to manage their remaining resources. The home's reputation for this type of assistance spread throughout New York's community of elderly women, leading to a steady stream of referrals from former residents, family members, and even legal professionals who had worked with O'Brien. Lawyers throughout the city knew they could recommend the Blessed Widow's Christian Home to clients who needed both housing and help managing their affairs. On the morning of November 15, 1847, a chill autumn wind rattled the windows of the Blessed Widow's Christian Home as residents gathered for their usual morning prayers. The chapel was filled with the soft rustle of woolen shorts and the quiet murmur of conversations as women settled into their customary pews. But as 6:30 arrived and Father Walsh took his place at the altar, an immediate sense that something was wrong settled over the assembled congregation. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore was not in her customary front pew. Eleanor Whitmore was a creature of absolute habit. In the 6 months since her arrival at the home, she had never once been late for morning prayers, never missed a meal, never deviated from her carefully structured daily routine. At 73 years old, she moved with the deliberate precision of someone who had learned that order and punctuality were the foundations of a life well lived. Her silver hair was always arranged in the same elegant chignon, her clothing always pressed and properly arranged, her posture always erect, despite her age. Mrs. Whitmore had been the picture of health just the day before, participating actively in the afternoon's needlework circle, where she had regaled the other residents with stories from her late husband's successful shipping business. She had discussed plans to write letters to distant relatives in Philadelphia, expressing particular excitement about corresponding with a grandniece who had recently announced her engagement. During the evening meal, she had been in especially good spirits, sharing memories of previous Christmas celebrations and asking Catherine Kelly about the home's plans for the upcoming holiday season. As the minutes passed and Mrs. Whitmore's absence became undeniable, Catherine Kelly rose from her usual seat near the back of the chapel. Kelly's normally composed demeanor showed signs of strain. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her apron, and her usual efficient movement seemed hesitant and uncertain. When she reached the front of the chapel, she turned to face the assembled women with tears streaming down her face. "Dear sisters," she began, her voice trembling with what appeared to be genuine grief, "I must share heartbreaking news with you all. Our beloved Mrs. Whitmore passed peacefully in her sleep during the night. Father Walsh was able to provide last rites, and she spoke of how grateful she was to have found such a loving family here with all of us. Her final words were about how blessed she felt to have spent her last months surrounded by such faithful Christian women." The announcement sent a wave of shock through the chapel that was almost physical in its intensity. Several women gasped audibly, others began weeping, and the murmur of distressed voices created a buzz of confusion and grief. Mrs. Whitmore had shown no signs of illness, no indication that death was approaching. She had been laughing during dinner the previous evening, sharing stories with enthusiasm and appetite. Mrs. Sarah Brennan, an intelligent 68-year-old who had been at the home for nearly 2 years, felt a cold knot form in her stomach as she absorbed Kelly's announcement. Something felt profoundly wrong about the entire situation, though she could not immediately identify what was troubling her beyond the obvious shock of sudden death. Father Walsh stepped forward to offer spiritual comfort to the distressed women, his rich voice providing the familiar cadences of prayer and scripture that usually brought peace during times of sorrow. He spoke about the unpredictability of God's calling, the blessing of a peaceful death, and the Christian hope of resurrection and eternal life. His words were appropriate and comforting, yet Mrs. Brennan found herself studying his face rather than absorbing his message. There was something in his expression, a subtle lack of genuine surprise or grief, that struck her as inconsistent with the sudden loss of a beloved resident. But what struck Mrs. Brennan as particularly strange was the speed with which everything had been arranged. By noon that same day, Mrs. Whitmore's body had already been removed from the building by undertakers, and Margaret O'Brien announced that she had been buried in a simple ceremony at Calvary Cemetery in Queens, in accordance with what she claimed were the deceased woman's final wishes. Mrs. Whitmore had expressed to me just last week her desire for a simple burial without fuss or ceremony, O'Brien explained to the gathered residents during the midday meal. She was quite specific about wanting to be laid to rest quickly and quietly, without burdening her new family here with prolonged mourning. She felt that excessive grief was selfish, and that we should celebrate her transition to eternal peace rather than dwelling on our own sense of loss. This explanation, while presented with O'Brien's usual authority and compassion, raised several troubling questions in Mrs. Brennan's mind. In all her months of friendship with Mrs. Whitmore, the deceased woman had never mentioned any preference for quick burial or simple ceremonies. Quite the opposite. She had often spoken about the elaborate funeral her husband had received, describing it with obvious pride and affection as a proper celebration of a life well lived. Mrs. Brennan's unease deepened when she attempted to pay her respects at Mrs. Whitmore's gravesite. When she approached O'Brien with this request, the director's response was gentle but firmly discouraging. "I understand your desire to honor Mrs. Whitmore's memory, dear," O'Brien said, placing a maternal hand on Mrs. Brennan's shoulder. "But her family, relatives from Philadelphia who arrived yesterday to make the arrangements, have specifically requested privacy during this difficult time. They felt that visits from non-family members might prolong their grief and prevent them from accepting God's will in this matter." The mention of family members came as a complete surprise to Mrs. Brennan. In 6 months of close friendship with Mrs. Whitmore, she had never heard any mention of relatives in Philadelphia beyond the grandniece with whom she corresponded occasionally. Mrs. Whitmore had consistently presented herself as a woman largely alone in the world, with only distant connections to family members she rarely saw. The mystery deepened further when Mrs. Brennan discovered that Mrs. Whitmore's personal belongings had also disappeared with remarkable efficiency. The ornate jewelry box that had held several valuable pieces inherited from her mother, the leather-bound journal in which she had written daily entries about her experiences at the home, the collection of photographs and letters that she had treasured as her last connections to her previous life, all had vanished from her room. When Mrs. Brennan inquired about these items, Catherine Kelly provided an explanation that was consistent with the story about the mysterious Philadelphia relatives, but no less troubling for its consistency. Everything was packed and sent to the family according to Mrs. Whitmore's written instructions, Kelly explained, her tone suggesting that such questions were slightly inappropriate. She had prepared very detailed directions about the disposition of her belongings, wanting to ensure that nothing would be wasted or forgotten. It's really quite touching how thoroughly she planned for her departure from this world. But Mrs. Brennan knew that Mrs. Whitmore had been working on organizing her belongings just days before her death, and the elderly woman had mentioned wanting to give several pieces of jewelry to fellow residents as remembrances. She had specifically discussed her intention to leave her pearl brooch to Mrs. Brennan herself, as a token of their friendship. Over the following weeks, as life at the home settled back into its usual routines, Mrs. Brennan began to notice other troubling patterns that she had previously overlooked or dismissed as coincidence. Mrs. Whitmore had not been the first resident to die suddenly and be buried with unusual haste. In the 2 years since Mrs. Brennan's arrival, 5 other women had passed away under remarkably similar circumstances. There had been Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, a 70-year-old widow who had arrived with a substantial inheritance from her husband's textile business. Mrs. Morrison had died suddenly in February 1846, just 4 months after her arrival, on a night when she had seemed perfectly healthy. Like Mrs. Whitmore, she had been buried quickly in a private ceremony that excluded the other residents. Mrs. Ruth Patterson had followed in August 1846, another wealthy widow who had contributed a significant entrance fee and died unexpectedly during her sleep. Mrs. Catherine Donnelly in January 1847, Mrs. Margaret Sullivan in June 1847, and Mrs. Elizabeth Hayes in September 1847, all following the same pattern of sudden nighttime death and immediate burial. The most unsettling realization came when Mrs. Brennan attempted to verify the details of these deaths with local newspapers. Despite the prominent status that many of these women had held in New York society, Mrs. Morrison had been well known in textile circles. Mrs. Patterson had been active in charitable organizations. Mrs. Donnelly had been married to a successful merchant. Not a single obituary had appeared in any publication. It was as if these women had simply vanished from existence, leaving behind only their wealth and their empty beds. Mrs. Brennan's growing suspicions received unexpected confirmation when she encountered Mrs. Morrison's former housekeeper, Mary O'Sullivan, at the local market. O'Sullivan had served the Morrison household for over 15 years and was devastated to learn that her former employer had died months earlier without her knowledge. Mrs. Morrison always said she'd send for me if she ever got sick, O'Sullivan confided to Mrs. Brennan over cups of tea in a nearby shop. She treated me like family, and I can't understand why no one notified me about her passing. I've been wondering why I never heard from her after she moved to that home. She promised to write every week, but I never received a single letter. This conversation revealed another disturbing pattern. None of the deceased women had maintained contact with their previous lives after entering the home. Servants, acquaintances, business associates, and distant family members had all been left wondering about the sudden silence from women who had previously been reliable correspondents. As winter settled over Manhattan in early 1848, the atmosphere within the Blessed Widow's Christian home began to change in ways that were subtle but unmistakable to someone paying close attention. Mrs. Sarah Brennan found herself observing daily routines with new eyes, noting patterns of behavior that she had previously accepted without question. The change was not immediately obvious to casual observation. The home continued to operate with its usual efficiency and apparent compassion. Meals were served punctually, religious services maintained their comforting rhythm, and the staff continued to demonstrate the same attentive care that had built the institution's sterling reputation. But beneath this surface normalcy, Mrs. Brennan began to detect currents of calculation and manipulation that chilled her to the bone. She noticed that Margaret O'Brien had developed a particular talent for identifying and cultivating relationships with residents who possessed substantial financial resources. During what appeared to be casual conversations over meals or in the sitting room, O'Brien would skillfully guide discussions toward topics of family relationships, financial planning, and personal history. Her questions seemed motivated by genuine interest in each woman's welfare, but Mrs. Brennan began to recognize a pattern in the information O'Brien sought to gather. "It must be such a comfort to know that your late husband provided so well for your future," O'Brien might say to a new resident. "Have you had an opportunity to organize your affairs since his passing? I find that many widows struggle with the complexities of inheritance law and property management. These conversations often led to offers of assistance that seemed both practical and generous. O'Brien frequently recommended lawyers, accountants, and other professionals who could help residents navigate the legal and financial challenges that many elderly widows faced. She spoke knowledgeably about estate planning, inheritance taxes, and the importance of ensuring that one's final wishes would be properly executed. "It brings such peace of mind," O'Brien would say, her voice filled with apparent sincerity, "to know that everything we've worked for will continue to serve God's children even after we're called home to heaven. The women who have chosen to remember our home in their wills have found such comfort in that decision. They know that their earthly possessions will be used to provide the same loving care for other widows who need our help." Father Walsh, too, had developed a sophisticated approach to spiritual counseling that seemed designed to encourage specific attitudes toward material possessions and earthly attachments. Residents who met with him privately often emerged from their sessions speaking about the vanity of worldly goods and the spiritual benefits of charitable giving. His counseling sessions frequently focused on biblical passages about the difficulty of the wealthy entering the kingdom of heaven and the blessedness of those who gave everything to follow Christ. Our Lord himself taught us that we cannot serve both God and money, Father Walsh would explain during his sermons. The accumulation of earthly treasures often becomes a barrier to spiritual growth, a chain that binds us to this world when we should be preparing our hearts for the next. True Christian charity requires us to release our attachment to material things and trust in God's providence for our needs. These theological discussions were presented with such apparent sincerity and backed by such extensive biblical knowledge that even skeptical residents found themselves influenced by Walsh's arguments. His youth and obvious intelligence made his words particularly persuasive, especially to elderly women who had been raised to respect clerical authority and defer to religious guidance. Catherine Kelly's role in the operation was more subtle but equally important. As the home's medical attendant, she maintained detailed records of each resident's health status, dietary needs, and medication requirements. Her nursing background allowed her to present herself as an expert in matters of health and wellness, and her recommendations carried considerable weight with residents who valued her apparent competence and caring attention. Kelly had developed a particular expertise in identifying residents who suffered from insomnia, anxiety, or other conditions that could be addressed with laudanum, a common medication that was readily available and widely prescribed for various ailments. Her treatment protocols often involved gradually increasing dosages over time, ostensibly to maintain effectiveness as patients developed tolerance to the drug. Many elderly women find that their usual sleep patterns change as they age, Kelly would explain to residents who mentioned difficulty sleeping. It's quite normal, and there's no reason to suffer unnecessarily when we have safe and effective remedies available. A small dose of laudanum before bedtime can help restore the natural rest that your body needs to maintain good health. Mrs. Brennan's growing awareness of these patterns was crystallized by a conversation she overheard in late February 1848. Unable to sleep due to the arthritis pain that often plagued her during cold weather, she had risen from her bed around midnight to walk the corridors of the home. Gentle exercise that usually helped ease her discomfort and tire her enough to return to sleep. As she moved quietly through the building's darkened hallways, she noticed light coming from beneath the door of Margaret O'Brien's office on the ground floor. Curious about who might be working so late and concerned that someone might need assistance, she approached the door intending to offer help. The door was slightly ajar, and through the opening she could see O'Brien seated at her desk with Catherine Kelly and Father Walsh gathered around her. The desk was covered with what appeared to be legal documents, small bottles of medication, and a leather ledger that O'Brien was writing in with careful precision. A small bag of coins sat to one side, and the occasional clink of metal suggested that it contained a substantial amount of money. The conversation she overheard froze her blood. The new resident, Mrs. Patterson, mentioned her late husband's shipping investments again today, O'Brien was saying as she made notes in the ledger. Catherine's assessment suggests she's worth at least $15,000, possibly significantly more. She has no children, no close family that she's mentioned beyond a nephew in Boston who she sees perhaps once every few years. Father Walsh nodded thoughtfully. She's been attending my counseling sessions regularly, and I believe she could be guided toward the proper spiritual perspective on material attachments. She's quite devout, very susceptible to discussions about Christian charity and eternal rewards. Her guilt about her comfortable circumstances, while others suffer, could be channeled toward generous charitable giving. Excellent, O'Brien replied, making additional notes. But we must be patient with the timeline. Too many transitions in a short period would raise questions that we cannot afford to answer. Mrs. Henderson has only been gone for 6 weeks, and Mrs. Whitmore's departure was just 3 months ago. We should wait at least another month before beginning the formal process with Mrs. Patterson." Kelly consulted a small notebook filled with her careful handwriting. "Mrs. Patterson has already begun taking laudanum for her sleep difficulties, though she doesn't realize that's what I've been giving her. I've told her it's a special herbal preparation that I make myself. Her tolerance is building nicely, and she's already comfortable with the idea of taking medication before bedtime. When the time comes, increasing the dosage will be simple and unsuspicious." "What about the legal preparations?" Walsh asked. O'Brien smiled with satisfaction as she referenced another document. "I've already begun discussing estate planning with her during our casual conversations. She's expressed concern about her nephew's gambling habits and has mentioned wanting to ensure that her money goes to worthy causes rather than being wasted on his debts. Suggesting that she leave everything to our home as a charitable legacy will seem like a natural solution to her concerns." Mrs. Brennan felt her knees go weak as the full implication of the conversation became clear. These people were planning Mrs. Patterson's death, discussing it with the casual efficiency of merchants planning a routine business transaction. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Whitmore had not died natural deaths. They had been murdered, killed for their money by the very people they had trusted to care for them. But even more horrifying was the realization that this was not a crime of opportunity or passion, but a systematic operation that had been running for months or possibly years. The careful planning, the patient cultivation of trust, the methodical approach to legal and medical preparation, all indicated a level of premeditation that made the crimes infinitely more chilling. Backing away from the door as quietly as possible, Mrs. Brennan returned to her room with her mind racing and her heart pounding. Sleep was impossible as she tried to process what she had learned and decide what, if anything, she could do to stop the next murder. The weeks following Mrs. Brennan's horrifying discovery became a period of careful investigation, conducted under the most dangerous possible circumstances. She knew that any obvious signs of suspicion or investigation would likely result in her becoming the next victim. Yet she also knew that she could not stand by and allow Mrs. Patterson or other residents to be murdered without attempting to stop the killings. Her first priority was to learn more about the true backgrounds of the 3 people running the home. If they were capable of systematic murder, she reasoned, they were certainly capable of lying about their identities and qualifications. Using her weekly trips to the local market as opportunities for discreet investigation, she began asking careful questions of merchants, neighbors, and anyone else who might have information about the home's staff. Her breakthrough came when she encountered Mr. Timothy Flanagan, the elderly clerk at St. Patrick's Cathedral, who maintained records of all priests assigned to serve in the archdiocese. During a conversation about the spiritual comfort that Father Walsh provided to the residents, Flanagan's response revealed a disturbing inconsistency. "Father Walsh, you say?" Flanagan asked, his bushy white eyebrows drawing together in confusion. "I'm afraid I don't know anyone by that name among our priests. Could you perhaps be thinking of Father William Walsh from St. Mary's? He's been serving that parish for nearly 20 years. But he's much older than the man you're describing." When Mrs. Brennan provided a more detailed description of their chaplain, Flanagan became even more puzzled. "No, I'm quite certain we have no Father Patrick Walsh in the archdiocese, and from what you're telling me about his age and appearance, I would surely remember him if he had been ordained here. Perhaps he's visiting from another diocese." This conversation prompted Mrs. Brennan to pay closer attention to Father Walsh's behavior during religious services. She noticed that while his sermons were eloquent and his biblical knowledge impressive, he occasionally stumbled over Latin phrases during Mass in ways that suggested he was reading from a text rather than reciting familiar prayers from memory. His pronunciation of certain Latin words was also inconsistent, sometimes correct and sometimes revealing an uncertainty that seemed inconsistent with proper priestly training. Most damning of all was an evening when she observed him alone in the chapel, apparently practicing his Latin pronunciation from a small book. She watched through a crack in the door as he repeated the same prayer multiple times, consulting the book frequently and moving his lips silently as if memorizing unfamiliar words. Her investigation into Catherine Kelly's background proved equally revealing. Through conversations with Mary O'Sullivan, Mrs. Morrison's former housekeeper, she learned about Kelly's supposed nursing experience at Massachusetts General Hospital. O'Sullivan's brother worked as a porter at that institution, and when asked about Kelly, he had no memory of anyone by that name working there during the period she claimed to have served. "My brother Patrick knows all the nurses who've worked at the hospital over the past 10 years, O'Sullivan confided. "He says there's never been a Catherine Kelly in their employ." "Are you sure that's where she said she worked?" Mrs. Brennan's most disturbing discovery came when she managed to gain access to O'Brien's office during the director's absence for a meeting with potential benefactors. The office was normally kept locked, but Mrs. Brennan had observed Kelly entering with a key that she kept on a ring attached to her belt. When Kelly was occupied with laundry duties in the basement, Mrs. Brennan used a hairpin to pick the simple lock, a skill she had learned as a child from a mischievous brother. Inside the office, she found evidence that confirmed her worst fears and revealed the true scope of the crimes being committed at the home. Hidden behind a false panel in the desk drawer, a hiding place she discovered purely by accident when the drawer stuck and she had to manipulate it to close properly. She found a collection of documents that painted a picture of systematic fraud and murder spanning multiple years. The documents included copies of wills, all leaving substantial estates to the Blessed Widow's Christian home, signed by women who had supposedly died natural deaths. But more horrifying still was a detailed ledger that listed each deceased resident by name, date of death, exact value of their estate transferred to the home, and brief notes about the method used to secure their cooperation. The ledger revealed that in just 3 years of operation, the home had acquired over $300,000 through the deaths of 21 women, far more than Mrs. Brennan had suspected. Each entry included notes about the woman's family situation, her estimated wealth, and the approach used to convince her to change her will. Some entries contained phrases that made Mrs. Brennan's blood run cold. Laudanum increased gradually over 6 weeks. Document signed while heavily sedated. Death occurred as planned, burial arranged within 8 hours, and no family inquiries received. But the most terrifying discovery came when Mrs. Brennan found a second ledger that appeared to contain future plans. Mrs. Patterson's name was listed with an estimated date for her transition just 6 weeks away and projected inheritance value of $18,000. Below her name were 5 other current residents, including Mrs. Brennan herself, with similar notations and financial estimates. Next to Mrs. Brennan's own name, someone had written, "Potentially problematic due to intelligence and observational skills, may require special handling." The discovery that she was already marked for death sent a wave of terror through Mrs. Brennan that nearly paralyzed her ability to think rationally. But beneath the fear was a burning determination to expose the truth and save the lives of her fellow residents. She carefully photographed the most important documents in her memory, then returned everything to its exact position before relocking the office door. Among the most chilling discoveries in O'Brien's files were letters of correspondence that revealed the true scope of the operation. O'Brien had been in contact with similar charitable institutions in Philadelphia, Boston, and Baltimore, sharing methods and even referring wealthy widows to each other when circumstances required moving victims between cities. The network of murder for inheritance schemes stretched across multiple states and had been operating for nearly a decade. One letter, dated just 2 months earlier, described the retirement of an operation in Philadelphia after certain complications arose with local authorities. The writer, signing herself as Sister Margaret, advised O'Brien to be prepared to close the current enterprise and relocate if necessary, and provided detailed instructions for destroying evidence and disposing of problematic assets. Mrs. Brennan also found records indicating that the home's sterling reputation had been carefully cultivated through strategic charitable donations and social connections. O'Brien had contributed substantial sums to various churches and charitable organizations throughout the city, using money stolen from murdered residents to build the credibility that allowed her to continue operating. She had also cultivated relationships with prominent members of New York society, hosting tea parties and charitable events that showcased the home's apparently exemplary work. The financial records revealed the staggering profitability of the operation. After expenses for maintaining the building, paying legitimate staff members who were unaware of the murders, and making the charitable contributions necessary to maintain their reputation, the three conspirators had accumulated personal wealth exceeding $100,000 each. They had invested much of this money in legitimate businesses and property throughout the city, creating the appearance of successful charitable administrators while building substantial personal fortunes. Armed with this horrifying evidence, Mrs. Brennan faced an impossible dilemma that grew more urgent with each passing day. She could not simply leave the home. Residents who attempted to depart early were always convinced to stay through various means, and those who insisted on leaving often fell mysteriously ill within days and died before they could complete their departure. She had witnessed this pattern with Mrs. Adelaide Foster, who had announced her intention to move in with a distant cousin in Boston, but had suffered a sudden decline in health that prevented her departure and led to her death within a week. Going to the authorities presented its own challenges. The Blessed Widow's Christian Home enjoyed an impeccable reputation in the community, endorsed by prominent churches and supported by wealthy benefactors who would find it difficult to believe accusations against such a respected institution. O'Brien was personally acquainted with several city officials and had cultivated relationships with influential members of New York society who would likely dismiss any accusations as the ravings of a confused elderly woman. More immediately threatening was the realization that her own investigations had not gone unnoticed. Catherine Kelly had begun paying unusual attention to her daily activities, appearing at unexpected moments and asking pointed questions about her sleep patterns, appetite, and overall health. The conversations were conducted with Kelly's usual professional demeanor, but there was an underlying quality of assessment that made Mrs. Brennan feel like a specimen being evaluated for some unspecified purpose. "You've seemed a bit restless lately, dear," Kelly observed one morning while distributing medications to residents. "Are you sleeping well? I've noticed you moving about the hallways at night, and I'm concerned that you might be experiencing some discomfort that's interfering with your rest." Father Walsh, too, had begun scheduling regular counseling sessions with Mrs. Brennan, despite her attempts to decline his offers of spiritual guidance. The sessions followed a pattern she now recognized as preparation for the final phase of the murder process. Walsh spoke frequently about the spiritual preparation for death, the importance of ensuring that one's earthly affairs were properly arranged, and the peace that came from releasing attachment to worldly possessions. "I sense that you carry some burden that troubles your spirit," Walsh would say during these sessions, his voice filled with apparent compassion. "Many women your age find themselves wrestling with questions about the meaning of their remaining years and the proper disposition of the worldly goods they've accumulated. These concerns are natural, but they can become spiritual obstacles if we allow them to consume our thoughts." Most alarmingly, O'Brien herself had begun making casual inquiries about Mrs. Brennan's financial situation and family connections. During what appeared to be friendly conversations over meals or in the sitting room, she would ask about distant relatives, investment accounts, and any legal arrangements that Mrs. Brennan might have made for the disposition of her modest estate. "I hope you won't think me presumptuous," O'Brien said during one such conversation, "but I've noticed that you never receive correspondence from family members, and you've never mentioned having legal representation for your affairs. As women age, it becomes increasingly important to ensure that their interests are properly protected. I would be happy to recommend attorneys who specialize in elder law and estate planning." Mrs. Brennan realized that she was being evaluated and prepared for murder, with the same methodical approach that had been used on all the previous victims. The process was so refined, so perfectly disguised as caring attention to her welfare, that she might never have recognized it if she hadn't discovered the truth about the home's operations. Her situation became even more precarious when she began to suspect that her food and medications might already be tampered with. She noticed that her evening meals sometimes had a slightly bitter aftertaste that she hadn't experienced before, and the herbal tea that Kelly insisted she drink for her arthritis often left her feeling drowsy and disoriented in ways that seemed inconsistent with its supposed ingredients. When she discreetly disposed of these items instead of consuming them, her sleep improved dramatically and her thinking became clearer. Changes that suggested she had indeed been receiving small doses of laudanum designed to make her more compliant and easier to manipulate. The crisis reached its peak on the night of May 3, 1848, when Mrs. Brennan was awakened by soft footsteps in the corridor outside her room. Through her keyhole, she could see Catherine Kelly moving silently through the hallway, carrying a small medical bag and a lantern turned down to its lowest setting. Kelly's movements had the deliberate quality of someone performing a familiar routine, and her destination was clearly predetermined. Kelly stopped at the door of Mrs. Patterson's room and quietly worked the lock open with what appeared to be a master key. Mrs. Brennan watched in horror as Kelly disappeared into Mrs. Patterson's room, knowing that she was witnessing the final act of a murder that had been planned for weeks. For nearly 20 minutes, Kelly remained in Mrs. Patterson's room while Mrs. Brennan struggled with the terrible decision of whether to intervene. She knew that confronting Kelly directly would likely result in her own immediate murder, but she also knew that remaining silent would make her complicit in Mrs. Patterson's death. When Kelly finally emerged from the room, she was no longer carrying the medical bag, and her movements had a satisfied, businesslike quality that chilled Mrs. Brennan to the bone. Kelly locked Mrs. Patterson's door behind her and disappeared down the corridor toward her own quarters, apparently confident that her work was complete. Mrs. Brennan knew that by morning, Mrs. Patterson would be found dead in her bed, another victim of the home's systematic murder operation. The thought of watching another innocent woman die while she remained safe in her own room was unbearable. Unable to witness another murder without taking action, Mrs. Brennan made a decision that she knew might cost her own life, but represented the only chance to save Mrs. Patterson and potentially expose the entire operation. As soon as Kelly's footsteps faded down the corridor, she crept from her room and moved carefully toward Mrs. Patterson's door. The lock that Kelly had used a key to open was now secured again, but Mrs. Brennan's childhood experience with picking locks served her well in this desperate moment. Working as quietly as possible with a hairpin, she managed to open the door and slip into Mrs. Patterson's room. What she found confirmed her worst fears. Mrs. Patterson was unconscious but still breathing, lying in her bed with an empty medicine glass on her bedside table that smelled strongly of laudanum mixed with something else, possibly chloral hydrate or another sedative that Kelly had added to ensure a fatal outcome. The elderly woman's breathing was shallow and irregular, and her skin had a grayish pallor that suggested the poison was already working to shut down her vital systems. Working quickly and as quietly as possible, Mrs. Brennan managed to rouse Mrs. Patterson enough to make her vomit most of the poison she had been given. It was a desperate measure that might not work, but it was the only intervention she could attempt without medical training or proper antidotes. For the next several hours, she sat with the semi-conscious woman, helping her drink small sips of water to flush the remaining poison from her system and keeping her awake to prevent her from slipping into the final coma that Kelly had intended. It was a terrifying vigil, conducted in near-total darkness, with the constant fear that Kelly might return to check on her victim. By dawn, Mrs. Patterson was weak but alert, and she listened with growing horror as Mrs. Brennan explained what had nearly happened to her, and what had definitely happened to the other residents who had died at the home. "They were going to kill me," Mrs. Patterson whispered, her voice hoarse from the effects of the poison and the forced vomiting. "But why? I've done nothing to harm anyone. I've been nothing but grateful for their care." Mrs. Brennan showed her the evidence she had gathered, the notes she had copied from O'Brien's ledgers, the details of the systematic operation, and the specific plans that had been made for Mrs. Patterson's murder and the theft of her inheritance. "It's about your money," Mrs. Brennan explained grimly. "They've been murdering wealthy widows and stealing their estates for years. You were supposed to die tonight, and by tomorrow they would have buried you and claimed your entire inheritance as a charitable donation to the home." The realization that her trust had been so completely betrayed left Mrs. Patterson shaken and terrified, but it also filled her with a determination to ensure that no other women would suffer the same fate. Together they developed a desperate plan that offered their only chance of exposing the murders and escaping with their lives. Mrs. Patterson would continue to pretend to be unconscious, while Mrs. Brennan slipped out of the building to contact the authorities. But they both knew that convincing the police to investigate such a respected institution would require more evidence than copied notes and the testimony of two elderly women. As the sun rose on May 4, 1848, Mrs. Brennan made her way through the empty streets of Manhattan toward the office of Detective Inspector Thomas Fitzgerald, one of the few police officials she believed might take her accusations seriously. Fitzgerald had built his reputation on several high-profile cases involving crimes against elderly and vulnerable citizens, and his willingness to investigate cases that other officers might dismiss had made him both respected and controversial within the police department. Fitzgerald's office was located in a narrow building near City Hall, up 3 flights of stairs that left Mrs. Brennan breathless and dizzy by the time she reached his door. The detective was a man in his early 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that suggested both skepticism and compassion, qualities that Mrs. Brennan hoped would serve her well in this desperate situation. Initially, Fitzgerald was politely skeptical of Mrs. Brennan's accusations. The Blessed Widow's Christian Home was well known to him as a respectable charitable institution, and the idea that it could be operating as a front for systematic murder seemed almost impossible to believe. "Mrs. Brennan," he said gently, "I understand that you're concerned about your fellow residents, but what you're describing would represent one of the most extensive criminal operations in the city's history. Are you certain that you haven't misunderstood some of what you've observed?" But as Mrs. Brennan presented the evidence she had gathered, the specific details of the forged documents, the systematic patterns of death and inheritance, and the carefully documented plans for future murders, Fitzgerald's skepticism began to give way to professional interest. The turning point came when Mrs. Brennan provided specific information about the financial accounts where the stolen money was being held and the names of the lawyers who had been used to process the fraudulent wills. This information was too detailed and specific to be the product of confusion or delusion, and it suggested access to records that an ordinary resident would never have seen. "If what you're telling me is true," Fitzgerald said, leaning forward in his chair, "then we're dealing with a conspiracy that goes far beyond simple theft. These people have committed multiple murders, and they're planning to commit more." But Fitzgerald also recognized the challenges they faced in investigating such a well-respected institution. Any direct confrontation with O'Brien and her associates would give them time to destroy evidence and potentially flee the city. He needed to gather enough proof to make arrests and secure convictions before the conspirators realized they had been discovered. The detective's plan was both bold and risky. Rather than conducting an obvious investigation that might alert the conspirators, he would place the home under discreet surveillance while using his contacts in the legal and financial communities to verify the information Mrs. Brennan had provided. Meanwhile, Mrs. Brennan would return to the home and continue to act as if nothing had changed while gathering any additional evidence she could access safely. It was a dangerous game that required her to continue living among people who had already marked her for death, but it represented their best chance of building a case strong enough to ensure convictions. The plan nearly collapsed immediately when Mrs. Brennan returned to the home to find Catherine Kelly waiting for her in the entrance hall with the expression of concerned authority. "Mrs. Brennan, wherever have you been?" Kelly asked, her tone suggesting both worry and suspicion. When you weren't in your room this morning, we were quite concerned that you might have had some sort of episode. Mrs. Patterson has taken quite ill during the night, and we were hoping you might have some information about her condition since you're such close friends. The mention of Mrs. Patterson sent a chill through Mrs. Brennan, but she maintained her composure and provided a carefully prepared explanation for her absence. I woke early with terrible arthritis pain and decided to walk to the market for some fresh air, she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. I didn't want to disturb anyone by moving about the hallways, so I let myself out quietly. I'm sorry if I caused any worry. Kelly's response suggested that Mrs. Brennan's explanation was accepted, but there was something in the woman's eyes that indicated increased suspicion and attention. Well, you must be careful about going out alone, especially so early in the morning, Kelly said. At your age, a fall or sudden illness could be quite serious. Perhaps in the future, you could ask for assistance if you need to go out for any reason. The conversation was polite and apparently caring, but Mrs. Brennan understood that she was being told, in the most diplomatic terms possible, that her movements would now be monitored more closely. Over the following 2 weeks, Detective Fitzgerald's investigation began to confirm the most horrifying aspects of Mrs. Brennan's accusations. His contacts in the banking community verified that the Blessed Widow's Christian Home had indeed received substantial deposits following the deaths of numerous residents, amounts that far exceeded what would be expected from ordinary charitable donations. The lawyers who had processed many of the wills reported that the documents had been presented by Margaret O'Brien herself, who had claimed to be acting as the executor for deceased clients. While the wills appeared to be properly executed, several attorneys now admitted that they had found certain aspects of the transactions unusual, particularly the speed with which the estates were settled and the lack of any family members challenging the distributions. Most damning of all was the discovery that the death certificates for many of the deceased residents had been signed by Dr. Edmund Morrison, a physician who had lost his medical license 3 years earlier for falsifying death certificates in exchange for money. Morrison had been operating illegally ever since, providing fraudulent medical services to anyone willing to pay his fees. When confronted by Detective Fitzgerald, Dr. Morrison initially denied any involvement with the Blessed Widow's Christian Home. But faced with evidence of his signature on multiple death certificates and the threat of prosecution for practicing medicine without a license, he agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Morrison's confession revealed the medical details of how the murders were carried out. Catherine Kelly would administer increasing doses of laudanum to selected residents over a period of weeks, building their tolerance while creating a documented medical need for the medication. When the time came for the final murder, she would give a massive overdose mixed with chloral hydrate, creating what appeared to be a peaceful death from heart failure or respiratory depression. The woman knew exactly what she was doing, Morrison told Fitzgerald during his confession. She understood dosages, drug interactions, and how to make murder look like natural death. I've seen trained physicians with less knowledge of pharmacology. Morrison also revealed that he had been providing death certificates for similar operations in other cities, suggesting that the network of murder for inheritance schemes was even more extensive than previously suspected. His records indicated fraudulent death certificates for operations in Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, and Richmond, representing potentially hundreds of elderly victims over the past decade. But while Fitzgerald's investigation was building a strong case against the conspirators, the situation inside the Blessed Widow's Christian Home was becoming increasingly dangerous for both Mrs. Brennan and Mrs. Patterson. Kelly's suspicions about Mrs. Brennan's behavior had continued to grow, and O'Brien had begun making more direct inquiries about both women's estate planning and family connections. The crisis came to a head on May 18th, when Mrs. Patterson was summoned to O'Brien's office for what was described as a routine discussion about her future care needs. Mrs. Brennan knew that such meetings had preceded the deaths of previous victims, and she feared that the conspirators had decided to accelerate their timeline due to their growing suspicions. Detective Fitzgerald had planned to wait another week before taking action against the conspirators, hoping to gather additional evidence that would ensure convictions on multiple murder charges. But Mrs. Brennan's urgent message, delivered by a young boy she had paid to carry a note to his office, convinced him that immediate intervention was necessary to prevent additional murders. On the afternoon of May 18, 1848, Fitzgerald arrived at the Blessed Widow's Christian Home with 4 other officers and warrants for the arrest of Margaret O'Brien, Catherine Kelly, and Father Patrick Walsh on charges of conspiracy to commit murder. He had timed the arrests to coincide with the regular afternoon gathering in the sitting room, when all residents and staff would be present and the conspirators would have no opportunity to destroy evidence or flee. But when the officers entered the building, they found O'Brien prepared for their arrival with a composure that suggested she had been expecting this moment for some time. "Detective Fitzgerald," she said calmly, rising from her chair in the sitting room where she had been reading to several residents. "What brings you to our humble home? I hope there hasn't been some misunderstanding that requires police intervention." The other residents looked on in confusion and growing alarm as Fitzgerald presented the arrest warrants and explained the charges against the 3 staff members. Several women began weeping, unable to comprehend that the people they had trusted with their lives were accused of systematic murder. Margaret O'Brien maintained her dignity and composure even as the handcuffs were placed on her wrists. "I'm afraid there has been a terrible mistake," she said, her voice filled with apparent sadness rather than anger. "Someone has obviously filled your mind with lies about our charitable work here. I pray that the truth will eventually come to light and clear our names of these outrageous accusations." Catherine Kelly, by contrast, became hysterical when she realized that her crimes had been discovered. She began screaming accusations at Mrs. Brennan, claiming that the elderly woman had sabotaged their work and destroyed their mission of caring for vulnerable widows. "She's the one you should be arresting," Kelly shrieked as the officers restrained her. "She's been poisoning the minds of our residents with paranoid fantasies. We've done nothing but provide Christian care for these women, and this is how we're repaid." Father Walsh attempted to maintain his clerical dignity, but his youth and obvious terror made his protests unconvincing. "There must be some mistake," he said repeatedly. "I'm a man of God, sworn to serve others. I would never harm anyone, especially not the vulnerable women in our care." But the most dramatic moment came when the officers searched O'Brien's office and discovered the hidden chamber behind the false wall. The collection of documents, ledgers, and correspondence that Mrs. Brennan had described was exactly where she had said it would be, providing irrefutable evidence of the systematic nature of the crimes. Even more shocking was the discovery that the operation had been far more extensive than anyone had suspected. The hidden records revealed not 21 murders, as the visible ledger had indicated, but 52 deaths over the 5 years since the home had been established. The earlier murders had been recorded in separate ledgers that documented the refinement of their methods and the expansion of their operation. The financial records showed that the 3 conspirators had stolen over $700,000 from their victims, a staggering sum that represented one of the largest theft operations in American history. They had used this money to establish legitimate businesses, purchase real estate, and create the appearance of successful charitable administrators, while systematically murdering the women they pretended to serve. But the most horrifying discovery came when the officers searched the building's basement and found evidence of the hidden burial chamber that would not be fully excavated until the building's demolition 21 years later. Behind what appeared to be a solid foundation wall, they found a carefully excavated chamber that extended beneath the garden behind the building. The chamber contained not just the evidence of recent murders, but a systematically organized burial ground with wooden coffins arranged in precise rows. The coffins were numbered and labeled, with detailed records beside each grave documenting the victim's name, date of death, method of murder, and the value of the estate that had been stolen. The records revealed that the operation had been far more methodical and extensive than even Mrs. Brennan had suspected. Each murder had been carefully planned and executed according to a refined protocol that minimized the risk of detection while maximizing the financial return. The conspirators had developed detailed profiles of ideal victims, wealthy widows without close family connections who could be isolated and manipulated without raising suspicions in the broader community. The basement chamber also contained evidence of the network of similar operations in other cities. Correspondence with charitable institutions in Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, and Richmond revealed a coordinated system of murder for inheritance schemes that had been operating for over a decade. Most chilling of all were the personal effects that had been stored with each body: jewelry, photographs, letters, and other mementos that the victims had treasured as their last connections to their previous lives. These items had been carefully catalogued and stored, apparently as trophies of successful murders rather than simple theft. The trial of Margaret O'Brien, Catherine Kelly, and Patrick Walsh became one of the most sensational criminal cases in New York City's history, attracting nationwide attention and exposing the vulnerability of elderly women in a society that provided them with few legal protections. The prosecution, led by District Attorney William Price, presented a case that documented not just the murders committed at the Blessed Widow's Christian home, but the entire network of similar operations that had been preying on vulnerable elderly women throughout the eastern United States. The evidence was overwhelming and horrifying. Medical experts testified about the sophisticated methods used to administer fatal doses of laudanum and other drugs while making the deaths appear natural. Legal experts explained how the fraudulent wills had been created and executed, often while the victims were sedated and unable to understand what they were signing. Financial experts detailed the complex system of accounts and investments that the conspirators had used to hide their stolen wealth, while building legitimate businesses that provided cover for their criminal operations. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from the survivors, Mrs. Sarah Brennan and Mrs. Patterson, whose courage and persistence had exposed the murders and saved countless future victims. Mrs. Brennan's testimony, delivered over 3 days, provided a detailed account of how she had discovered the truth about the home's operations and the desperate measures she had taken to save Mrs. Patterson's life and expose the crimes. Her careful documentation of the patterns she had observed and the evidence she had gathered provided the foundation for the prosecution's case. Mrs. Patterson's testimony about her near murder was equally compelling. She described the trust she had placed in her caregivers and the horror of realizing that they had been planning her death while pretending to care for her welfare. "I gave them my trust, my money, and nearly my life," she said during her testimony. "They smiled at me, prayed with me, and spoke of Christian charity while planning to murder me for my inheritance. If not for Mrs. Brennan's courage, I would be dead and buried in that basement chamber with all the other women who trusted them with their lives." The defense attempted to argue that the deaths had been natural and that any financial irregularities were simply poor record-keeping rather than evidence of systematic theft. They portrayed O'Brien as a dedicated charitable worker who had been overwhelmed by the complex demands of caring for elderly women, and they suggested that the accusations were the result of paranoid fantasies by confused elderly residents. But the physical evidence was overwhelming. The systematic organization of the basement burial chamber, the detailed records of planned murders, and the sophisticated financial operations all pointed to a level of premeditation and organization that made claims of innocence impossible to maintain. The revelation of the defendants' true identities during the trial added another layer of horror to the case. Margaret O'Brien was revealed to be Elizabeth Morrison, a former nurse who had been suspected in a series of suspicious deaths at hospitals in Philadelphia and Boston. She had developed her scheme after observing how easily elderly patients could be manipulated into changing their wills, and how rarely such deaths were investigated when they occurred in respected institutions. Catherine Kelly was actually Margaret Collins, a former morgue attendant who had been dismissed from her previous position for stealing from the dead. Her expertise in handling bodies and administering drugs had made her an ideal partner in the operation, providing the medical knowledge necessary to commit undetectable murders. Father Patrick Walsh was revealed to be James Murphy, a former actor who had never received any religious training, but possessed the charisma and confidence necessary to convince vulnerable women to trust him with their spiritual and financial affairs. His supposed ordination was completely fraudulent, supported by forged documents and false references. The investigation that followed the arrests revealed the true scope of the murder for inheritance network that had been operating throughout the eastern United States. Police departments in multiple cities began investigating similar charitable institutions, leading to additional arrests and the exposure of hundreds of additional murders. In Philadelphia, the St. Catherine's Home for Elderly Women was revealed to be another front for systematic murder, with over 30 victims discovered in a hidden basement chamber similar to the one in New York. The operation had been run by Elizabeth Morrison before she moved to New York and established the Blessed Widow's Christian Home. Boston authorities uncovered evidence of a similar operation at the Mercy House for Widowed Ladies, while Baltimore police discovered that the Christian Sanctuary for Elder Women had been murdering residents for over 8 years before closing suddenly when local suspicions began to grow. The total number of victims across all the connected operations was estimated to exceed 200 women, making it one of the most extensive serial murder cases in American history. The amount of money stolen was calculated at over $2 million, an enormous sum for the 1840s that represented the life savings of hundreds of elderly women. The exposure of the network led to significant changes in how charitable institutions were regulated and monitored. New laws required regular inspections of such facilities, background checks for staff members, and legal protections for elderly residents who wished to change their living arrangements. The trial concluded with convictions on multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, fraud, and theft. The evidence was so overwhelming that the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Margaret O'Brien was sentenced to death by hanging, a sentence that was carried out on October 15, 1849, before a crowd of thousands who had gathered to witness the execution of one of America's most notorious female criminals. She maintained her innocence until the end, claiming that she had been wrongly accused of crimes committed by others. Catherine Kelly received a sentence of life imprisonment and was sent to the Auburn State Prison, where she died of tuberculosis in 1863. She spent her final years writing detailed confessions that revealed additional murders and provided information that helped solve cold cases in multiple states. Patrick Walsh was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but died of pneumonia after serving only 6 years. His death was attributed to the harsh conditions in prison and his inability to adapt to the physical demands of incarceration. The Blessed Widow's Christian Home was closed immediately after the arrests, and the building was sold to private owners who converted it back into a residence. But the building's dark history made it difficult to sell, and it changed hands multiple times before finally being demolished in 1869. The demolition revealed additional evidence of the crimes, including the full extent of the basement burial chamber and personal effects that had been hidden throughout the building. The discovery of 52 complete sets of remains confirmed the scope of the murders and provided closure for families who had wondered about the fate of their elderly relatives. Mrs. Sarah Brennan, whose courage and persistence had exposed the murders, became a celebrated figure in the movement for elderly rights and institutional reform. She used her experience to advocate for stronger protections for vulnerable elderly women and better oversight of charitable institutions. She lived for another 15 years after the trial, during which time she worked with legislators to draft new laws protecting elderly residents of charitable institutions. Her efforts led to the establishment of regular inspection requirements, mandatory background checks for staff members, and legal protections for residents who wish to leave such facilities. Mrs. Brennan also worked with Detective Fitzgerald to investigate other suspicious charitable institutions throughout the region, helping to prevent additional murders and expose fraud in several other cases. Her expertise in recognizing the warning signs of institutional abuse made her a valuable consultant for law enforcement agencies dealing with similar cases. Mrs. Patterson recovered fully from her near-death experience and used her saved inheritance to establish a legitimate, charitable foundation that provided assistance to widows throughout the city. The Patterson Foundation, as it became known, offered both financial assistance and legal advocacy for elderly women who found themselves vulnerable to exploitation. The foundation also established the first shelter specifically designed to protect elderly women from financial predators and abusive family members. The shelter provided temporary housing, legal assistance, and advocacy services for women who needed protection while organizing their affairs or finding safe permanent housing. Both women remained close friends for the rest of their lives, bonded by their shared experience of surviving one of America's most horrifying criminal conspiracies. They continued to speak publicly about their experience, using their story to educate others about the warning signs of institutional abuse and the importance of maintaining connections with the outside world. The case of the Blessed Widow's Christian Home had a profound impact on American society's understanding of the vulnerability of elderly women and the need for legal protections against exploitation. The systematic nature of the murders and the sophisticated methods used to conceal them revealed how easily trust could be exploited when combined with social isolation and limited legal protections. The case also highlighted the particular vulnerability of widows in 19th century America, where women had few legal rights and limited options for independent living after the death of their husbands. The murders demonstrated how these vulnerabilities could be exploited by criminals who understood the social and legal systems that left elderly women defenseless. The public outrage generated by the case led to significant reforms in how charitable institutions were regulated and monitored. New laws required regular inspections, background checks for employees, and legal protections for residents who wished to change their living arrangements or complain about their treatment. The case also led to changes in inheritance law and estate planning, with new requirements for independent verification of wills and additional protections against fraud. These changes made it much more difficult for criminals to steal inheritances through coercion or fraud. Perhaps most importantly, the case demonstrated the importance of maintaining social connections and outside oversight for vulnerable elderly individuals. The isolation that made the victims easy targets also prevented outside intervention that might have saved their lives. Do you think something like this horrifying operation could happen in today's world? Or have our legal protections and oversight systems evolved enough to prevent such systematic murder? The story of the Blessed Widow's Christian Home reminds us that evil often wears the mask of charity and that vigilance is the price of safety for society's most vulnerable members. Just when we thought the horror in this Manhattan home couldn't get worse, the full scope of the network they uncovered revealed a conspiracy that stretched across multiple states and claimed hundreds of lives. If this story has given you chills, share this video with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support our investigation into America's forgotten crimes, and subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. The 52 women buried in that basement chamber had trusted their caregivers with their lives and their fortunes, never suspecting that their Christian charity was actually a sophisticated operation designed to rob and murder them. Their story serves as a chilling reminder that the most heinous crimes can hide behind facades of respectability and religious devotion. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe that proper oversight could have prevented these murders, Or were the social conditions of the 1840s too different from today to allow for adequate protection? Share your theories in the comments below and let us know if you'd like to hear more stories about America's darkest historical mysteries. Until next time, remember that the past holds secrets that can still shock us today, and that justice, even when delayed, can still provide closure for the forgotten victims of history's most calculating killers.